Good afternoon, good evening, and very good morning to all of you, depending where you are. We had a slight technical issue today, so we're starting a little bit late, but that's good. We're all here. My name is Jun Yang. I'm the director for the Institute for Corporate Governance at Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. And Kelley ICG was founded in 2004, and our mission is really research oriented. We want to create and disseminate high quality research that really help us understand and advance corporate governance policies and really informing debates from different perspectives and influence organizational practice. So we have organized this whole series of public lectures since November 2021. Today is lecture number 16. And this is the first time we have a scholar from the marketing research side. I'm very excited about today's lecture. Our co-host is ECGI, European Corporate Governance Institute, and the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University. Special thanks go to Marco and Elaine at ECGI and our colleague Scott Shackelford from the Ostrom Workshop. So today's lecture has the title of The Ethics of Consumer Choices. So this incorporates both consumers' perspective and corporate perspective in terms of considering ethics, sustainability. And our speaker today is Professor Neeru Paharia from Arizona State University. And the moderator is my Kelley colleague, Professor Vivek Astavansh from IU. And coming up, this is the last lecture for this academic year. We have 3 more scheduled for the coming fall semester. The first one is a bit different, is a fireside chat on CEO markets. So it's about private company CEO market versus public company CEO market. So we have 2 speakers, Professor Stephen Kaplan from University of Chicago and Professor Dirk Genter from London School of Economics. I will be the moderator for that event. And October 5th, we have shareholder voting talk. So Professor Nadia Malenko, who is joining Boston College, will give that talk. And on December 7th, we have an interesting talk. We've talked about ESG or sustainability a lot of time. And at this point, many people start to pause and to re-examine the walks and the talks. And so this topic is greenwashing. Is there a greenwashing, or are some firms doing greenwashing? So this is going to be a very interesting lecture. Professor Pedro Meadows from UVA is going to be the speaker. And our former IU colleague, Professor Jenny Gao from Georgetown University, will be the moderator. So this is the QR code for our next event on September 14th. CEO markets, public versus private firms. You have 25 seconds. You could take out your device and just scan the QR code. So you'll be ready to go for the next event. So it's going to be a spiced up event. Even the 2 speakers have somewhat different views on the CEO market. So I really look forward to that lecture. So now I'm going to introduce today's moderator. So Vivek is my colleague from IU. He's assistant professor of marketing, and he has many expertise in various areas of great interest of mine and probably the great interest of many of the audience, such as product recall, innovation, customer complaints, customer experience, chatbot, digital marketing, social media. Sometimes I don't even know what's the relationship between these words, data breach, firm bankruptcy, geopolitical risk, political risk, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and even labor unionization, terrorist attack. So these are new words for me. And he's very prolific scholar, and Vivek has published in numerous top journals, including the Journal of International Marketing, Harvard Business Review, POM, Production and Operations Management, and Manufacturing and Service Operations, management. Without further ado, Vivek, the podium is yours to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, June. Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to introduce my marketing colleague, Neeru Paharia. Neeru is a full professor of marketing at the W.P. Carey School of Business, Arizona State. She joined Arizona State in the fall of last year, if I'm correct. And prior to that, she was a faculty member at McDonough School of Business, Georgetown University. And prior to that, she was running the Center for Ethics at Harvard University, where she earned her PhD as well, or more exactly, the DBA. She studied economics for her undergraduate program at UC Davis, and from there she moved to study a master's in the Department of Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon, and then she pursued her DBA from Harvard. Now look at the bottommost row. That tells you how eclectic, diverse, prolific over a period of time Neeru has been. So bottom row, leftmost graph tells you from 2009 to 2023 how productive Neeru has been. So the length of the blue bar is the number of articles she has published, and the line graph that you see is the number of citations that her research articles have earned. So both pieces of evidence tell you she has been awesome. And these graphs are not mine. These graphs are from Scopus. So it's a third party that is giving you evidence of how diverse and sustainable as an academic Neeru has been. Now look at the pie chart. What do you see there? You see there the eclecticism, but on a different dimension. And that dimension is the journals in which she has published. Many, many journals. Of course, she's a marketing professor. So you see the blue bigger pie, which is occupying 24% of her articles. Those are Journal of Marketing. Then you see Journal of Consumer Research, so on and so forth. But look at the left side of that pie chart. So many journals, and that tells you how interdisciplinary or trans or multidisciplinary Neeru has been. Now go to the bottom row, rightmost. You see here evidence on the impact that Neeru's research has had on practice. Because until now, I was talking about the impact on research, on the citations is basically impact on other academics. But look at the impact she has held. So her research has total found 315 mentions, and I can tell you 315 is a very high number for academic research. Social media mentions, news and blogs, and her research has been cited in policy documents and patents as well. I don't know whether Neeru knows this, because she deserves a part of all the money that the industry is making, borrowing her research and implementing it and becoming rich and richer. I'll pass it back to Neeru now. Neeru, the stage is yours. And of course, audience, as and when you have questions, please leave them in the chat window. It's my job as a moderator to summarize your questions and ask Neeru starting at about 1 o'clock. So in about 50 minutes from now. Neeru, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you for such a wonderful introduction, Vivek. I did not know that I am entitled to some extra money, but I'd love to see some checks coming in if that's what I'm entitled to. Okay, great. Well, I'm super excited to talk to you today. Actually, let me just make sure I get this share done correctly. Okay. All right. I am super excited to talk to you today about the ethics of consumer choice. And I will say I am a professor at ASU in marketing, and my expertise is on consumer behavior, primarily on issues surrounding things like sustainability ethics. So when do consumers think about these things? When do they not? How can we get them to think about it more? So here, so that topic isn't really necessarily directly related to corporate governance, but it is very much directly related to sustainability, which is a topic that corporate governance has been addressing recently. So I have tried to situate this particular issue around consumers within the broader discussion around ESG and corporate actions towards sustainability. So so we'll kind of get through a variety of things. And one of the things I want to do in this talk is really, I think what helps me think about these issues and makes me pause and think more carefully about them is when you zoom out and look at the whole system of how we're producing, how we're consuming, why we're consuming, and then what are the consequences of all this consumption in terms of our one natural resource that we have, this planet that we all share and live on, and the kind of externalities that might result from our consumptions that we're not necessarily really pricing into products or taking into account fully. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, again, is around consumer behavior. And when we think about consumer behavior, one of the ways we can think about it is in alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals around responsible production and consumption. And so what we are thinking about broadly as a collective is how do we grow profitably in ways that are sustainable with production and consumption, such that, you know, we're not going to continually deplete our natural resource and create a situation for our future generations that's unfavorable. When we think about ESG, there's lots of things people talk about with ESG and much debate on what those things should include and what those things should mean. But what I'm mainly focusing on, my topic of inquiry here is primarily directed to environmental issues and labor issues, particularly when we're thinking about, underpaid labor or working conditions and those kinds of things. And just to start off, since I'm a marketing professor and marketing professors are really actually in business schools just to entertain others. No, I'm just kidding. I want to show you this quick video from the show The Good Place that I think kind of articulates very well the conundrum that consumers often find themselves in just by consuming everyday products for their personal needs.
Life now is so complicated. It's impossible for anyone to be good enough for the good place. I know you don't like to learn too much about life on Earth to remain impartial, but these days just buying a tomato at a grocery store means that you are unwittingly supporting toxic pesticides, exploiting labor, contributing to global warming. Humans think that they're making one choice, but they're actually making dozens of choices they don't even know they're making.
All right, so I think what this really speaks to is, when we look at the whole system and who the players are, what is the role of the consumer when we think about sustainability? And what is their responsibility? What is their agency? And sort of what is the scope of what they can actually do? So when we think about sustainability and things like that, we can think about four kind of actors. So we can think about consumers. Maybe consumers will demand to consume sustainably or be interested in sustainable consumption. Companies in terms of their production. So are companies producing sustainably? Governments in terms of regulation, and investors in terms of what kind of influence they might have on companies and governments and maybe even indirectly on consumers. So when we think about companies and their reasons to prioritize ESG related efforts, sustainability efforts, some are kind of no-brainers and maybe slow to be picked up just due to, institutional issues or legacy and things like that. But cost savings, we can think about energy efficiency. We can think about our shareholders or our stakeholders in terms of our reputation. And here, I think one of the things I won't talk about too much, but I think is really interesting is how employees have been more influential in firms on various ESG issues, political issues, and you can look at what has happened. I mean, Ron DeSantis and Disney and everything that's going on in Florida on a variety of dimensions. Really, when we think about one of the points of leverage, employees have a lot of power in encouraging the firms that they work for to, prioritize certain ESG efforts. Consumer demand. So maybe companies might focus on ESG efforts because that's what consumers want. Consumers are demanding more sustainable products, and therefore companies might respond. Investors, so there's been a few examples recently of investors really prioritizing ESG and using their power with boards and in various other ways to kind of push companies to focus on ESG. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And then regulatory compliance here, and here we might want to reduce risk. What I think is really interesting here is how we can think about not only in the U.S. we have our federal government, but state governments actually also have a lot of power in actually creating new regulations and then somewhat sort of like forcing companies to comply, especially if they have a big enough market. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so when we kind of, again, like I mentioned, zooming out, I think is always really helpful for me to think about how a whole system might operate. So from a company's perspective, they may want to generate demand and consumers buy products, and this is sort of what they're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to sell things, we're supposed to grow, and consumers need a lot of these products and services, and so they're serving a function. Regulation might actually impact these firms in terms of how they produce, what kinds of emissions, what kinds of carbon levels they're allowed to pollute or exert into the atmosphere, and labor conditions and all these various other things. So some of this gets sort of the rules of the game get dictated by regulation. And then we have shareholders. So recently we're also seeing shareholders in enforcing some of their power, especially related to ESG kind of concerns on firms in terms of committing to net zero and various other things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So when we think about firms and what are the reasons for them to prioritize ESG, one of the things, kind of probably the biggest thing to think about is, well, consumer demand, like we'll focus on ESG. The market will respond to consumer demands. And that's sort of a assumption that we all have. If consumers demand it, the market will respond. So consumers want something, companies will make that because it'll be profitable to do so. And so that's one of the main things I want to talk about right now is this whole idea of consumer demand and really thinking about it on three levels. One is how consumers react to the growth imperative and why it's hard for consumers to resist it in some way, why consumers maybe aren't the best point of leverage. So consumers, I believe from what I've researched, there are many reasons that make it hard for consumers to care about ESG concerns, and then some kind of solutions that we can think about. So if we think about the growth imperative, so companies generate demand and then consumers demand products. And so this is sort of how we achieve profits, achieve growth, and continually evolve. So part of this, though, is this growth imperative that we must also always continually grow. And in order to grow, we need to increase our sales and revenues to some extent. So things have to kind of continually grow. And we can look to two places to find that growth. One is to encourage consumers to consume more, so increase consumption from our existing set of consumers, or find new consumers. And so in 2017, there were 3.5 billion consumers in the kind of consumer class. And by 2030, that number is projected to grow to 5.6 billion. And so, and much of this coming from Asian countries with increasing economic development. Now, all this is fine, but we do live on a planet that has finite resources. There's only one planet that we have right now, and there's only so much iron and so much coal and so much gold and gas and oil. And that is sort of a fact. It's not really a political point. And so what some have estimated is that in order to provide the amount of resources for this growing consumer class, that we're going to need another Earth. And that's just impossible to acquire unless, Mars really becomes terraformed and that also, works out. But really, for our practical purposes, that right now that seems sort of unfeasible. Secondly, all this production has negative externalities. And what I mean here is that when we produce things, there may be pollution, there may be, you know, various other things that impose a cost that isn't necessarily being priced into the product. So it could be labor, it could be the environment, but it's not being priced into the product such that the companies aren't paying for it, the consumers aren't paying for it. And so then the question is, who's paying for it? So if we impose a cost, then it must be that it gets paid for in some way. So maybe it gets paid for in a very general sense by the world and the carbon emissions and global warming, and this is like a very diffuse expense. Or it could be a particular community bears the brunt of some of these negative externalities. And we do have, you know, concrete numbers around this. So looking at fossil fuel emissions, a study from Harvard estimated that fossil fuel emissions are responsible for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, premature deaths worldwide. And that's mainly coming from the pollution in countries like China and India. So there's very real costs to these externalities that are sort of diffuse and get applied in these ways that are just sort of general. Like if you just happen to be in the area that has a lot of pollution, you know, you might pay a higher price for that. Now, I think one of the things that interests me, and what really actually even got me interested in studying consumer behavior and becoming a marketing professor, really was thinking about how consumption and how consumers are really the end node of much of this. So much of the pollution and much of these externalities are driven by consumer goods and by our need to consume and by our lack of pricing in these externalities into the prices of the product. So consumption does appear to be one of the ultimate drivers of a lot of these kind of ESG concerns that we have. And yet, again, like the system is built on increasing the number of consumers or increasing the amount we consume. So as consumers, and I think a lot of the discussion around some of these issues tries to put the responsibility on the consumer. So as a consumer, can we just consume to choose less, right? If we are the end node of all of this, can we choose to consume less, or can we consume more sustainably? Can we prioritize products that price in these externalities or don't have them, or whatever it may be? But as consumers, it's very challenging to battle the growth imperative. And I think much of that is actually driven by marketing, where marketing, you know, one of marketing's jobs is to increase the top line. And to increase the top line, we need to increase sales and revenue and growth. And much of that, again, is about increasing consumption. And sometimes that consumption, and again, I just want to give you an example to put in perspective how justified, or how we can kind of think about consumption in two different ways. One, in terms of things that we actually need, and sometimes we can think about things that are manufactured needs, but they're so embedded into our culture that we think of them as actual real needs. So we can think about the tomato, that might be an actual need. You know, we need to eat, right? So that's pretty clear. But I think my favorite example, and I offer this example because it sort of illustrates the really extreme case here, but I think one that is so pervasive that it's one that we don't really even question, is the case for diamonds. And when we think about diamonds, there are these beautiful, pretty shiny rocks. And the market for diamonds, we think about $80 billion is the global market, half of which comes from engagement rings. So if we think about diamonds and think about it sort of from an economic perspective, there's actually a perfect substitute for a diamond. So it takes time, money, resources to mine diamonds, and yet we could create a lab-created diamond for 1/10 of the price. So many years ago, fake diamonds were actually different in structure. So like cubic zirconium, moissanite, these other particular stones. But recently they've created the technology to create a lab created diamond, which is identical in structure to a natural diamond, so much so that equipment to detect the difference between a lab created and a natural diamond would actually cost, $20,000 to $40,000. So arguably more than the diamond itself to actually see if it's real or not. Some people say, so some people would say, well, diamonds are valuable because they're kind of shiny and they're pretty and there's no perfect substitute, but I would argue there is a perfect substitute, which is a lab created diamond. Some would argue that diamonds are valuable because of a resale value. It's a good investment, but that's also not true. The actual resale market for diamonds is between 5 and 30% of the original price. Many say say things are valuable like diamonds because they're scarce, but that is also not true. So the most scarce gemstone is actually tanzanite, which can only be mined in a 3 square mile area of Tanzania. But it's actually only a third of the value, a third of the price of a diamond. Add to that, if you think about scarcity, how many brides in the US have diamonds? It's about 80%. So it's not really that scarce if you think about people who have them or don't. A Lamborghini might be more scarce, but a diamond, in fact, isn't really that scarce at all. So we have all these reasons to think that diamonds are valuable, but really even the chairman of De Beers said that diamonds are intrinsically worthless. And so again, kind of zooming out to the whole system, does it make sense that we're spending all these resources mining diamonds and money and effort, and even on the consumer side, using that money to buy a diamond when you could use it for something else, when this is, thought to be an intrinsically worthless product? So some of the reasons we can think about why people buy diamonds are psychological. So we have various motivations for buying products, some which are functional, some like a sponge. You need a sponge to clean your dishes. We need cake because it makes us feel good. So that would be emotional. But something like a diamond really fulfills this need for identity and social status. And so again, when we think about consumers, we kind of need to take a step back and think about, well, our consumers, we're a lot of our consumption is based on our kind of body and our brains and how everything works. So we're animals at the end of the day, and our thoughts are ephemeral, and so they kind of come and go. And so we need something tangible like a diamond to kind of remind us of who we are. So you might have thoughts that are constantly generating all the time, but when you look at that diamond, you remind yourself of who you are and that somebody loves you. And that's why cults and things like that, like, try and take away all your possessions so you lose your identity. There's also this idea of conspicuous consumption and wastefulness. And so one of the things one of the theories is that as animals who live in a community, one of the things we want to do is convey our social status to others. And one way of doing that is by wasting resources. So one of the good examples here is that, many years ago, people would grow lawns, at the advent when lawns were invented, because it was a sign that they didn't have to use their land to grow food. So it was considered to be wasteful. And that's partly what diamonds do for people. And so where animals might fight for status with physical aggression. So think about baboons and koalas. There's the alpha baboon and the alpha koala. They're able to kind of fight off all the other koalas and all the baboons and achieve all these resources and have all the females and all the territory. We kind of do the same way with these expensive products. So we're not that different. We just sort of exhibit our dominance in a more kind of civilized manner. And so you can look at, Jennifer Lopez got a $1.8 million diamond ring, Demi Lovato, over $1 million. So this is a very alive and well practice. And I think here again, like I'm illustrating this example because when you put it in context with production, having all these negative externalities, then it begs the question, does this make sense? And so I think one of the geniuses of this campaign, this was back when diamonds actually really became popular as an engagement ring, One of the things at that point in time, the context of that moment was this whole psychological kind of selling these symbolic products was a new idea. And at that point in time, companies were really focused on selling utility goods and services, things that actually do things for you, very functional. And one of their statements of the people who ran this marketing campaign was to think about how to make a diamond a psychological necessity capable of competing with utility goods and services. Now, at this time, this might seem pretty normal, but at the time, you just think about how crazy that is to actually think about getting somebody to spend their money on something that's purely symbolic, as opposed to something that has functional and real utility value. So I think one of the things here we think about, again, is that consumption is these are just things that demands that people have, and these are inherent and these are part of our culture. But my point is that this was actually manufactured. So 10% of US brides received diamond engagement rings in 1939. And by the end of the 20th century, it's 80%. It's such a strong tradition that most people don't even really question whether this makes sense or not. Now, they tried to run this campaign in Brazil and in Europe and in various other countries, and it didn't actually work. So it worked in the US, and it didn't work everywhere. So what we assume is something that we need is not necessarily true. Could this formula be applied to other products? So we can look at the whole market for luxury products, and it sort of functions on a similar principle that we're buying and selling symbolic products. So if you look at this Hermes bag, it's $14,000. What's the functional value here? Maybe you could argue the quality and the functional value is $1,000. So what you are really buying is kind of the symbolic value. And most products have some element of the symbolic value, some element of functional value, and some element of emotional value. So taking a step back, needs are manufactured by marketing, and we are social creatures. So we don't necessarily have the ability to resist. When everybody else is getting a diamond engagement ring, it's hard for us to think that we shouldn't need it. So that leads me to the question, what is the value of a system where labor is expended and environmental harm is created purely in the pursuit of a symbolic product, and one that has no aesthetic or functional benefits beyond the alternatives? So again, we're taking a look at, this whole system of consumption and externalities and marketing creating needs. Just a few more examples. If we look at the beauty industry, the whole market for makeup, again, this didn't exist 100 years ago, and it was invented by marketing, by Hollywood, so much so that now it's something that we don't even really kind of question or think about. So marketing is really tied into the fabric of culture. And on another dimension, when we think about consumption and we think about generating needs, planned obsolescence has been another big driver of consumption. So one of the issues with the original automobile was that people were buying the car and not coming back to buy more. And so this became a problem, right? How do we make profits if people aren't coming back to buy another automobile? They just bought their automobile and they were happy. And so one of the things that evolved from that was this idea of versioning and planned obsolescence, so that every 2 years we'll upgrade the vehicle, make it a little bit more fashionable, add some features, but also maybe not make all these things backwards compatible with the original versions. And the same kind of trend happens with fashion, that we always have to sort of upgrade to the newest versions. Okay, so taking a step back, we have companies that are generating demand and consumers that are demanding products. And we need to kind of keep that going and grow that. But again, one of the issues here is that all this production and all this consumption has these negative externalities that aren't necessarily being priced in to this whole system that we really need to think about. But I think one of the things that my point being is that we really need to think about this whole idea of, why are we generating demand? What are we getting people to buy? And does this make sense? does it make sense to sell symbolic products that have real environmental consequences? Can we think of a symbolic product that has less, environmental consequences? And maybe that's a better way of doing it. But to kind of take a step back and think about whether this ever increasing consumption is actually moving us in the right direction. Okay, so one of the things about consumers is, why they don't care. So one of the things we can think about, companies might think is, hey, well, let's, consumers care about sustainability. So maybe this is some direction we can go in. But again, we're sort of battling some kind of psychological issues that consumers don't necessarily really consider. So do consumers actually care about ethical issues such as sustainability and environmental issues, labor, et cetera? And here we're presented with a paradox. So the majority of consumers claim they do care and are willing to pay for such products. However, the market for sustainably produced products is actually quite small. So that doesn't really add up. If consumers are saying, hey, we're willing to pay more for sustainably produced products, then you would imagine, again, like the market will respond to that. But what we find is that that's not true. And so the question is, why is that? Why are consumers not demanding sustainability if it's something that they care about? So maybe people aren't being honest, and you find there is, some social desirability in these kinds of surveys. Oftentimes, you might get more accurate answers if you ask, what would your neighbor pay for more sustainability? But maybe people are not really being honest. But I think there's also a lot of other issues. So one is that there's an information problem. So maybe we don't know about these production conditions enough that it will impact the choices we make. So I think a great example here is the chocolate industry. So it actually turns out, and this has been an issue for many years, that there is a lot of child labor in the supply chain for the production of chocolate. And yet I would imagine that most people don't know that. That when you buy your Hershey bar, you think you're just buying a Hershey bar. So it's not necessarily transparent about how and what is going on in the supply chain here. Maybe people do know. So I think people do have a general sense. So we could say it's an information problem, but to some extent, maybe people do have a sense. So, 10 years ago, there was a lot of information in the media about Apple products and some of the labor conditions there. So you could imagine that in certain cases, people do know. And so if they do know, why are they not doing anything about it? So in these cases, maybe they're motivated to think about it a little bit differently, which I'll mention in a minute. Maybe it's a chicken and egg problem. So maybe consumers would buy products that were more sustainable if there were more choices. And we're starting to see this emerge now. But just as an example, I am a professor and I need to buy suits. And I have tried to buy a suit that was certified, produced sustainably, and it just doesn't exist. There's literally zero options. So if that was on the market, maybe they would generate some sales. So maybe it's a chicken and egg problem. You've got to actually create the supply first, and then consumers will respond. There are also a bunch of different reasons that consumer researchers have looked into about quality inferences. So for certain kinds of product categories, people believe that sustainable products are not going to be as effective as unsustainable products. And other research, my recent paper looked at durability and how consumers don't really consider durability. They tend to focus on more the short-term price savings as opposed to the long-term durability of a product, which if you were to calculate something like a price per wear, would actually be more favorable. We can look at motivated processes. So let's imagine that, there is all this stuff going on in the supply chain and we might have some idea about it, but we don't want to know. So maybe here, researchers have looked into this idea of willful ignorance. that we don't want to know what's going on in the supply chain, and we don't want to have this kind of ethical information, because once we have that information, it creates this sense of dissonance, and now we have to do something about it. So we're motivated to be ignorant about it. In some cases, maybe we do know about it. So we maybe read all those articles from Apple, back in 2012. But then we're going to be motivated to try and justify it. And so one of my past papers, we looked at this idea of these economic justifications, and that when people really want a product, so if you show someone an iPhone or a really nice pair of shoes, they're more likely to agree with these statements, such as sweatshop labor is the only realistic source of income for workers in poorer countries. Now, we could argue whether these things are legitimate or not, but the fact that people may or may not agree with these things based on how much they want something leads us to think that consumers may be inconsistent with the way they think about these kind of sustainability issues. Another issue that prevents consumers from really considering or caring or demanding for sustainability in their products comes from the way the whole economy is structured and organized. So you imagine a firm, a brand, like a Nike or a Gap or something. The production for their products actually is outsourced. So the production actually happens outside the boundaries of the firm. It happens in a faraway location. And so there's this sort of level of indirectness that keeps consumers from really, really caring about it, because they're not actually doing anything. The firm's not even doing anything. They'll just say, well, we outsourced it to somebody else, and then they outsourced it to somebody else. And so from a consumer psychology perspective, this creates this sort of diffusion of responsibility. And along with that, if we think about the way the economy and the supply chain is structured, many years ago, before mass production, things were more based on what's called a made-to-order economy. So basically I go to the tailor and I say, hey, can you make me this suit? And then the tailor makes a suit. So there in that particular organization, demand comes first. I want the suit, and then supply comes after. What we transitioned to in the era of mass production was a made-to-stock economy, where the firm achieves economies of scale by making 10,000 suits in 3 sizes and in 3 colors, and then puts them on the rack, and then hopes that they can find enough consumers to buy those suits. So that's a made-to-stock economy. But what a made-to-stock economy does is it also limits the agency that a consumer has. So in a made-to-order economy, I cause the suit to be made. But in a made-to-stock economy, I go to the store, somebody else already decided to make the suit, they decided how to make the suit, and really if there was any issue in the production of that suit, the damage has been done, and I had no, I didn't cause that to happen. And the perception is it doesn't matter whether I buy this or not, like the damage has been done. So I don't really have any agency in this decision. So our economy is set up in a way that kind of limits feelings of consumer agency. And one of the questions I like to ask is, would you lock a child in your basement and have them make your clothes for you? And most people would say no to that. They would balk at that idea. At least I hope they would. But really what we're doing is we're hiring a company to do it for you. So you're hiring a company to do it for you. It's happening far away. You don't really know what's going on. There's not much information. You might have a vague sense that some of these things are happening, but you're not really directly causing it to happen. So the way the economy is set up in such an abstract and diffuse way limits consumers' feelings of agency and responsibility in a way that's really inconsistent with their morals, with what they would do if they had to do it themselves. And I think, that's something I think, again, to kind of take a step back and reflect on this. If it's not something you would do yourself directly, does it make sense that we would hire somebody to do it for us in this particular way? So we can think of kind of taking a step back, that we can think about, some of these needs are manufactured, some of them aren't, but the system is really set up so that we don't care about the costs, because they are far away, because we don't have all the information, because we're motivated, because we really want things. Basically, we're not kind of set up to care about the cost as much. And so kind of coming back to our system here, these externalities are not as much in the forefront of our minds as if they would be if we had to kind of do things more directly. So what are the solutions? Again, we have finite resources, we have negative externalities, and we have these players. So where should the burden be? Who should kind of be responsible for this shared resource that we have? And so we can think about consumers. And when I started my studies in consumer behavior, I thought, wow, consumers are the ones who really have all the power, because they can demand that their products be made more sustainably. And then everything else should just kind of flow through that. But as I researched this and learned about it, I kind of felt more bearish on consumers and their impact for change. Companies, governments, and investors. So we can think about all these kind of points of leverage. Going back to the consumer, we can think about more recently some trends around how citizens have been kind of converging their identities as citizens, where we would typically vote, if you want certain legislation and certain regulations, that you would vote on those things. And as a consumer, that's a very amoral domain. We just buy things, right? That we buy things because we need them. We don't really think about the morality of it much. But these two identities have been merging. And so you see more kind of voting with our dollars, and a number of examples of this in recent years where consumers are kind of becoming more activists, most recently with Budweiser and some trans issues that's been really interesting to follow recently. So this is an ongoing issue, but I think really, again, what it comes down to is if companies produced products sustainably, where they price in the externalities, would consumers pay? And one example here, kind of thought experiment, is if we think about the chocolate industry. Again, if they've done some studies and found if they were to increase the wages and that the farmers get by 40%, that would allow a living wage, which would help prevent child labor. That would add about 10% to the price of a candy bar. So our Hershey bar, instead of $1, would be $1.10. Now, the question is that okay? And many would say, well, that's a burden on the consumer. I would argue the counterfactual, which is that what if in the US we had no labor regulation and we had no environmental regulation? That price of a chocolate bar would be 80 cents, or 90 cents. And so we as a community have decided that we want a certain kind of floor. And so we've accepted that as a value, and that has been enacted by legislation. And so that's a question, and I sometimes feel like that argument doesn't really consider the other side of things. So I think the bigger question, though, and what really I came down to after studying this, is should consumers have this responsibility? And I think, really consumers, it's quite a burden. I mean, you're asking consumers to monitor factories in different countries and engage in all these search costs to find products that are sustainable and make sure that they are sustainable. But I think also what you're doing is you're forcing them to make these trade-offs, like, again, with this chocolate, what if we didn't have labor conditions in this country and we didn't have environmental conditions? So then the consumer would have to say, well, if I want that, I'm going to have to pay 10 cents more. And for the consumer in that moment, that's a difficult decision to make. So we're forcing them to make these kinds of economic trade-offs, which I think can be burdensome to the consumer, which becomes easier if it was just regulated and there was a floor put in, and now there's no question. So for companies, sustainable production. So one of the things that companies can do is how can companies increase consumer demand for more sustainable products? And here also is where research has really looked at a variety of different strategies for making it easier for consumers to make sustainable choices. So really basic stuff. Some of these are really basic and some of these are more kind of recent research oriented strategies, but one is just having choice. So, you know, again, like I can't find a sustainable suit. If there were a few on the market, I'd buy one. EVs, right? So now that there's more choice, people are making more purchases here. Reducing monetary and behavioral costs. So increasing the number and availability of charging stations, right? Reducing the burden on consumers, making it easy. Information and transparency. Now, again, like if you use this model of as a consumer, I'm hiring a company to do something for me, to make my products for me, then that would argue that I should have access to all this information about how are you making my products, you know? And a lot of this information is hard to access, but some companies have been like Patagonia, focusing on transparency, and Everlane, so giving consumers the information that they might want. Really basic things about segmentation. So there are groups of consumers who care more about sustainability issues than others. So how do we use those consumers to, you know, maybe achieve economies of scale? Quantification and concreteness. So, and I think these are some issues that even get involved with ESG reporting, but how do we think about how to quantify things like sustainability in a way that's meaningful and easy for consumers to process? So I would argue this particular, you know, ad by Allbirds gives us the carbon footprint, but it doesn't give us what that means. You know, what does 7.1 mean? So how can we present information in a way that is meaningful to consumers? So one strategy was this like light bulb minutes. So how much food production costs in terms of light bulb minutes is a way that consumers maybe have a better understanding of. In the context of durability, you know, one of the things that firms can do is to estimate how long products will last, which will allow consumers, or even just calculate the price per wear for them. So then you can make a more kind of apples to apples comparison when you're buying something cheap and not long lasting versus something that's more durable and long lasting. In terms of recycling, we can think about how to make the end use of recycling more concrete. So what will this product be turned into? And that might make it more concrete and motivational for consumers. Eco labels. So we've talked about eco labels like Fair Trade America. Again, I can't go monitor a factory in another country, but you know, these eco labels can help give me sort of a shorthand as a consumer to understand the ethical implications of products. As I talked about, production is so far away. So how do we increase that sense of connection, kind of an emotional connection with the producer? Again, as a consumer, we don't want to harm others. So how do we make it more clear that there is actually another person on the other side of this? Along with that, buying local. Ownership and agency, I talked about that a little bit with made to order production can make increase agency. Again, we are social creatures. So O-Power has used these sort of normative appeals. So comparing you to your neighbors, and we sort of understand what we're supposed to do by what our neighbors do. Making these kinds of things conspicuous. Patagonia has become sort of like a badge of symbol of being an environmental supporter. Social status. So even some of these electronic vehicles and these kind of more green products have become these sort of more eco-chic, I would say, kind of expensive and status-oriented products. New business models like Rent the Runway, which focuses on, you know, rather than everyone buying a dress, that we could reuse the same dress across many people, carbon offsets. And, you know, really at the end, you know, one that's probably not that popular is dematerialization. So how do we reduce consumption? And as I mentioned before, some of this consumption is purely symbolic. So how do we kind of how do we question what we consume and not just consume more and more and more just for the sake of growth? And companies like Patagonia have been spearheading that. Okay, so let me try and, I know I only have a few minutes, so let me try and wrap up a few other things here. So governments and regulation. And so what is the role of government here? And you know, there are lots of issues to think about here. And in the US, you know, obviously it's some of these things get very politicized. You know, some would say there's a moral responsibility for governments to regulate some of this stuff. Companies, you know, tend to not appreciate regulation, although in some cases they might want it because it could create a floor for their competition. And even Larry Fink said, you know, as he was also saying, you know, these things like environmental issues and ESG are going to be material for companies, that it is for governments to make policy and enact legislation, and not for companies, including asset managers, to be the environmental police. So legislation could be a way to regulate some of these things, and sometimes we can use these more market-based approaches like incentives and taxes, HOV lanes, things like that, to get consumers to adopt some of these products. And we have seen, and I think it's interesting that when you look at state governments in particular, the kind of leverage they might have in enforcing or encouraging companies to invest in EV. So I would argue that some of the regulations here have really built up that particular industry. More recently, New York State passed the Fashion Sustainability, not passed, but is trying to pass the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. So trying to basically set a floor for companies that sell fashion products in New York, that they maintain a certain level of sustainability tracking, labor conditions, et cetera. But if a state like New York imposes this kind of a law, then you know it's an incentive to have your whole supply chain compliant. So governments can set a floor so that companies can not you know, to make them pay for these externalities, but it kind of create a level playing field. So there's no incentive to kind of race towards the bottom. Governments also create this collective action problem for consumers. So the one thing about consumers, you know, they may demand sustainability, but it's hard to feel efficacious as one consumer, and so that limits their motivation. And then we can think about political economy, right? How do we invest in sustainable technologies? Now you can also think about investors, you know, so Larry Fink mentioned environmental, social, and governance issues will increasingly be of material value to corporate valuations. So investors recently have been also wielding their influence on companies. And so some of the biggest asset management funds and state pension funds have been pushing towards net zero. But what's interesting here with the pension funds and even these asset management funds is the backlash from the Republican state governments against some of this stuff. So, but these investors also have a lot of influence in terms of voting rights, investments, disclosures, and more recently, what we saw with ExxonMobil, where these activist investors were able to elect 3 kind of ESG friendly people to the board, creating, you know, big changes in policy. So again, we have kind of in conclusion, we have one planet and we have to manage it effectively. And there are various forces at play. And when we take a step back, we really need to think about which ones of these arrows is functioning effectively, and which ones make sense. You know, is the idea that we just need to grow and grow and grow and consume and consume and consume in a way that's sustainable, maybe, but you know, we can also think about, taking a step back, does this all make sense? And you know, a lot of the focus has been on consumers and on shareholders and on these other parties, but maybe, you know, regulation is something and I think they're stepping in because things aren't necessarily, at least in the perceptions of some, that regulation isn't really managing this resource in a way that is properly pricing in all these actual costs. So I will end there. Hopefully that was at least provocative, and happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Neeru. I think one of the striking aspects of your presentation was the slides. They were very beautiful, very engaging.
It's a marketing thing, right?
Yeah, I was about to say that if a marketing professor does not do a very thrilling job of keeping the audience engaged and marketing the topic and showcasing the importance of that topic, who will? We are richer because of marketing. So I'll read out some questions. I'll paraphrase them, and then one by one you can answer those questions, Neeru. So the first question that we came was for Shein, which has received a lot of criticism about its labor conditions and environmentally unsustainable practices that it has adopted. The irony is that Shein dresses sell for $5, $7, $10. So even if I care about the environment and the society, it's just that these prices are so low. So all the morals, all the ethics go into the back pocket when all I have to do is pull out a $7 or a $10 bill. So the question is, why do consumers not care, or why do they care? They care because it simply is a question of whether they can afford. Perhaps consumers should be encouraged to recycle more and buy a used $7 dress from a Goodwill store. So any comments on that, Neeru?
Yeah, I mean, consumers are emotional beings, and I think when I started studying this, I reflected on my own behavior, and I still reflect on my own behavior, that when I go to the store and I see a cute pair of shoes, and it's been really hard for me to find a cute pair of shoes, and they fit me really well and they look amazing and they're cheap, I want them, and then I'll tell myself, well, sweatshop labor is okay because people need jobs and companies need to make money. And so our desire is strong. And I think on one level, you're putting someone in a tough situation. You're basically like making someone sit in front of a piece of chocolate cake and say, don't eat it. That's really what it is. And I think that's where I said, you're forcing people to say, I'm not going to buy this, or I'm going to search far and wide to find a suit. I can't even find a suit that was made sustainably. And I'm not going to eat this chocolate cake. So and then when I think about consumers, like, they're very busy, and they're, that you're a parent, you don't have time, you see, So I feel like it kind of puts consumers in a situation that it's hard for them to resist, and I if we were tougher, maybe we would, or maybe, like I said, maybe if instead of going to Shein and buying the dress, I had to hire the workers myself and not pay them, right? And if I had to do that, maybe I wouldn't, right? Like, then maybe I would care more. So we're just given the temptation, and we're not really exposed to any of the costs. So it makes it really easy for consumers to make that decision. And so again, when you look at the system is set up so that consumers don't really feel those costs. Where I doubt that many people would do such a thing to someone directly, like force somebody into some poor working conditions and underpay them and to make me a dress,
Thank you, Neeru. I'll add one point there. So the reason why Shein is able to sell that $7 dress, whereas if you go to Walmart or Target, it will cost you $35, is because of a legal loophole in the United States. The legal loophole, what happens is that Shein manufactures things in, say, China, ships them to the Mexico-US border. When I want to place an order, then it is priced at $7 and it is taken out of a truck. That one piece of cloth is then shipped to my house. Because that one piece is being shipped to an individual customer, Shein does not pay any customs. So this is
They don't pay any customs.
they don't pay any custom. However, if Target
Oh.
wants to sell that or Walmart wants to sell that, they will have to ship them in a bulk load and will have to pay what? 78% duty. Welcome to the United States.
Oh,
So
wow.
now, those of you who live in the United States, you have the power to vote. All right. The next question is, on your certified suit, Neeru, why isn't anyone selling the suit that you want to wear? You mentioned that chicken and egg. What is the solution to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, like maybe when Patagonia started, they would say, oh, well, no, there's no demand for this, right? And then they just had to try and put it out there and see what happened. I don't know if that's the case. If a company was a well-funded company with a good marketing budget, was able to produce suits and produce enough variety that it actually became viable, would people pay more? Would they pay more for it, for something that was sustainable? I mean, and we have some examples to think that they would. If you look at companies like Patagonia, people do pay more for sustainability. But what they also did is they built that into their brand. It's such a strong brand value that I feel like in order to get somebody to pay that extra money, you have to kind of really build up that brand value to make it more kind of meaningful to them.
Right. And
maybe I'm just a really small market, like I'm a market of one. I mean, I looked up like on Google search trends, you can not on Google search trends, but if you were on the keyword planner, on Google's keyword planner, you can get search volume for various keyword searches. And so I looked up sustainable suit and it's like nothing. It's negligible. No one is trying to buy a sustainable suit. So again, maybe, when we say marketing creates needs, maybe this is a job for marketing to create that demand because it's not there already. But it can be done. I mean, they can sell diamonds. They could probably create demand for sustainable suits as well.
Right. I'll give an interesting anecdote. In the state of Indiana, a restaurant server is paid what? $3 per hour. $3. Okay. So I'm working with a local brewery. They increase the hourly wages to what? $15. Okay. That is livable wage in this place. And then what they did was they increased the prices of all the food and beverages by 20%. And they said, okay, dear patrons or visitors, please do not pay any tip because we are now paying our servers and backroom staff livable wage. And we've increased the prices by 20%, which is the acceptable level of tip. Okay. Then I was interested in, okay, what are customers responding now? And I mind their text to look at what are their emotions. Customers don't like that. And the reason is they want to have the power to either penalize the server or the cook for poor food, or they want to reward. Now, what this restaurant has done is they are trying to make the playing field level, but customers are not liking this. So this is not environmental sustainability, but this is social sustainability. You will be able to enjoy food in restaurants only when the servers are not dependent upon we paying them tips, but rather are equitably paid. But this is what's happening right now. Okay.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Neeru, one more question, and this is a very interesting question written by Anonymous. So Anonymous, if you are listening to me, thank you. The question is, how would you go about marketing contentment?
Contentment.
Yeah, beautiful word. And this person has put it in a singular quotes. A beautiful word. How do you market contentment? And that basically expands what marketing is. We have so far focused on marketing of goods and services, but marketing and emotion, contentment. Neeru, over to you.
That's when I get fired for having a good answer. Yeah, I mean, you see this. It's interesting. You see, there is like a big movement towards mental wellness and emotional wellness, and I think one of the biggest apps that the most downloaded apps is Calm, or one of the Headspace, one of the meditation apps. So and it's interesting how that space gets commercialized as well, right? All this wellness stuff gets commercialized as a way to make money as well. But yeah, like how do you escape this? And I think it's really hard, because again, like everything is, if you were to get married and didn't get a diamond engagement ring, that would be hard to do. It would be hard to say, no, I don't want one, because it's very socially embedded in our culture. I would say, when I think the example of the diamonds, I really like that, because one of the pieces of that is very clear that was created by a marketing campaign. And when I talk to my students about that, they're shocked, because nobody questions this whole idea of diamonds and whether we need them and whether it makes any sense. But when you really kind of take a step back, we have this whole idea in marketing of persuasion knowledge, right? And that's what that is, right? That this whole idea that, oh, somebody's kind of tricking me into buying this thing. Maybe that could be helpful in defending yourself against some of this stuff. But the idea of marketing contentment is so interesting. Like, how do we kind of focus on how do you think about your savior as not being the consumer sphere, but being something more emotional? But somebody has to have the incentive to do that. And again, what's the incentive? It's financial, and that means I have to sell you something, which is contentment.
I think anonymous or some other anonymous has answered the question that it is all about marketing goodness, kindness, compassion, and that's correct. I think it's a good reminder that marketing as a discipline is not meant exclusively to market goods and services. We are broader than goods and services.
Right. Ideas.
A more fulfilling life, a more beautiful life, a more peaceful life. With that, there are a couple of other questions, but I'll have to cut short and pass it back to June. So June, over to you. Thank you very much, Neeru, and thank you for all the questions, folks.
Thank you so much, Neeru, and thank you, Vivek. Actually, I have a small story on that. My husband kept trying to buy me a big diamond ring for wedding anniversary. I kept postponing it. In my mind, I kept doing the calculation that if I give this $30,000 to my writer daughter, she can travel around the world. She can find many interesting people and write interesting stories. So that might be her next book. So that's sort of the trade-off I keep having in my mind. What are the alternative usage of the same money? Otherwise, I would spend on this big piece of stone. So I think that's a question probably all of us need to keep thinking, especially if you have a daughter, your solution tend to be a lot more clear. That's my experience. All right, so going forward, we have 3 lectures scheduled. These are all traditional corporate governance topics like CEO markets, shareholder voting. Greenwashing is kind of, right now have so much research on ESG, especially environmental related issues. To what extent, whether we are at a turning point to look back, look at the research, look at the debate, and see whether really these organizations are walk their talks. So I think that's also going to be a very important issue. Thank you again. Thank you, Neeru, and thank you, Vivek, for bringing us a wonderful lecture from the marketing research perspective. I would have to say goodbye to everyone. I will see you in September. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.